I, Barack Hussein Obama, do solemnly swear.
A historic moment as Barack Obama becomes the first African-American elected President of the United States. What has it meant for race relations in America? Hello, I'm Nathan King, sitting in for Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. To be clear, disparity between blacks and whites in the United States on such issues as income, social justice and place in society existed long before Barack Obama ever took office. But what is also true is the hope and expectation by many who propelled him to office that his election might mark a turning point in race relations. Candidate Obama himself tried to temper those expectations when, in a 2008 speech, he said, "I've never been naive enough to believe we can get beyond racial divisions in a single election cycle or candidacy." He has governed with the self-proclaimed belief that rising tides lift all boats, but as the United States continues to recover from the Great Recession, African Americans disproportionately continue to struggle. And then there's this. According to the website Mapping Police Violence, more than 100 unarmed black people were killed by police in 2015. That's 5 times the rate of unarmed whites. Such incidents, along with the killing of 9 people last June by a white shooter at a historic black church in South Carolina, compelled the US president to speak out.
For too long, we've been blind to the way past injustices continue to shape the present. Perhaps we see that now. Perhaps this tragedy causes us to ask some tough questions about how we can permit so many of our children to languish in poverty, or attend dilapidated schools, or grow up without prospects for a job or for a career. Perhaps it causes us to examine what we're doing to cause some of our children to hate. Perhaps it softens hearts towards those lost young men. Tens and tens of thousands caught up in the criminal justice system, and lead us to make sure that that system's not infected with bias.
Powerful words from US President Barack Obama. And joining us here in Washington to talk about all this is attorney Barbara Irnwine. She's the president and founder of the Transformative Justice Coalition. Joe Madison is a long-time civil rights activist and radio talk show host with SiriusXM's Urban View channel. And with us is economist, commentator and author Julianne Malveaux. Her upcoming book is entitled Are We Better Off? It focuses on race, President Obama and public policy. Thanks, 3 of you, for joining us. Julianne, let's start with you. You've got the book coming out. We saw the clip there, and we also heard earlier about President Obama saying he's not naive. Transformative race relations can't happen in one term or one president. Given that, though, is there any disappointment because he has been the first African-American president?
You know, there's been profound disappointment. On one hand, there's been enormous pride. Every time we see the president walk onto Air Force One, hear him do a proclamation, our hearts open up. And the older we are, like my mom, you know, great aunts, they really are enormously proud. At the same time, I'm an analyst and I'm a realist. And when we look at the numbers, there's more black poverty now than there was when the president took office. And so not only that, but he has declined opportunities to make a symbolic difference. He's made many symbolic differences, but he also has declined to make some symbolic differences. And so you have, depending on who you're speaking within the African-American community, you will get a sense of disappointment. I opened the book up talking about the blind man and the elephant, or the blind person and the elephant, as
Great
I say.
parable, yeah.
Where, you know, they go up and it's a trunk, it's a tree. Depending on who you are, that's how you experience this president. And many people have experienced them, especially if you're African-American in the top 1%. The number of African-Americans earning more than $200,000 a year went up under this president. Slightly, but it went up. At the same time, the number in poverty went up as well.
Barbara, do you think he was damned if he did and damned if he didn't? Because, you know, he's the first black president and could have been criticized for going over the top for helping the black community. Isn't it better to raise all boats, of which people of color, perhaps in poverty or
It never has worked.
Tell me why.
The trickle-down politics, the trickle-down economic, all of those theories have never worked for the black community. You need targeted, very specific, racially conscious, and really well-designed programming to make a difference for African Americans. That's what's been missing, very sadly, in this administration. And he's had poor advisors.
You know, I want to just piggyback off of a couple of things, and I'll take the elephant analogy first.
Which is also a symbol for Republicans, so we'll get on to that.
We're sorry about that.
Yeah. But you know, there's also another adage, and that is, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time.
Very good
The
point.
other thing is, this thing about all boats rise. Look, here's the answer to that. Some of us have dinghies. And, you know, a dinghy will rise and a yacht will rise. What African Americans are tired of is being in dinghies. What good is it if we rise at the same time, but we still are in a dinghy? So the reality is that the president has not done what he should be doing before there's a tragedy. As I watched this, I thought to myself, he said the right things, but look what it took. 9 lives. Being shot
and almost 7 years.
And 7 years.
And you know, the gap, I mean, racial economic gaps have not closed under this president, unfortunately. And again, there have been opportunities. When we passed the Recovery Act, for example, money went to the states. What if it had gone to cities, which are blacker, browner, older, younger, and more female? You have hit more disadvantaged people that way. You could have, when he did these promise zones, you could have had more urban areas included in these promise zones. So basically, you've had a president, we know that he's the president of all of America, but you know, to adages that we talked about off air, you won't get fed in your mama's house if you don't bring the plate to the table. And African Americans have not pushed this man hard enough to do what he needs to do.
And I also think, quite honestly, let's also be honest, you had on the very first day, you had a United States Congress that said, even if it hurts our constituents, we're not going to help this president.
I want to get to that. Was there actually a racial backlash, do you think?
Absolutely.
Okay, let's take it in turns.
We're unanimous on that one.
Absolutely.
Okay,
Absolutely.
so we all agree on that. But Joe, how did that manifest itself?
It manifests itself in a do-nothing Congress. That's how it manifests itself. Simple as that.
And
Even more than that, you know, we had a minister out of Arizona who preached that he prayed for this president's death.
That's right.
And now, had someone preached that they prayed for a white president's death, were they an African American? The FBI would have moved in with them. Mitch McConnell said his goal with this man
was
to
the
be a
one-term
president.
But has
Barbara.
people forgotten that there were marches in the streets of Washington, D.C. with thousands of people holding Sambo signs, with the president, you know, being made to look like a Sambo, and Hitler, and all of this, you know, all of these hate that was directed towards him in his first year of the presidency. You see, what I think is that they came into this presidency with an ostrich mentality, that somehow they're going to put their heads in the ground and pretend that people don't see race. But people always see race.
But now
and he never was going to be able to
But now
be...
the ostrich has lifted its head, and the ostrich is Donald Trump. And I mean
No, that's not an ostrich, that's a dodo bird.
Big dodo.
And what I mean by
I could
that.
just leave now. You guys can run.
Well, what I mean by that is we're going to take America back. Back to where? Back from who?
They
I'm
always
an
were saying
American.
It's racially
They were
loaded
saying
language.
that.
Is that what you're
Absolutely.
saying?
If
to start with?
that
you want to
was
go back to the good old days, it's like good for who?
Right.
In
1940s?
1940,
Are you serious?
70% of all black women were maids. I don't want to go back to the 1940s. I don't know how to sweep. I mean, we talk
We
about
have vacuums now.
whatever.
It sounds like you do the cleaning in your house, which is very good.
But, you know, but basically, we've got all kinds of racially coded language,
Right.
but not only
Yes.
coded language, but with this president, they don't have to code. When a congressman from South Carolina yells from the floor of Congress, you lie.
Right.
You've never seen that before.
And none of you for a second think this is just the general deterioration of American politics. You think it's accelerated because of President Obama being black. I just wanted to get that on the record.
Well,
Yes,
here's what you get on the record. You go back to, someone once said that we go back to Jim Crow. We all know the history of Jim Crow.
But for our international audience, just describe that, because that's a phrase.
I mean, Jim Crow was just outright segregation by law. I mean, segregation's a legal term. What you now have is the same, and you're the lawyer. Now what we have, though, is James Crow Esquire. It's just a sophisticated form of what Jim Crow was 50 years ago. And since you have an international audience, let's make something very clear, and our good friend Dr. Frances Welsing would remind us if she was here, that this is a global
Yes.
issue. This
Yes,
is not just the
anti-black
United
racism.
States of America. This is global.
And we're seeing it in Europe. You know, we're seeing the backlash not only to Muslims, but it's also been to African immigrants
Right.
in England, in France, in Germany. And so we know that basically the roots of European capitalism were about the exploitation of black people.
Founded in slavery.
But,
Yes.
but even with all of this backlash, he could have done more.
Yes.
That's where we.
Because this
gotta
is where
talk
I was
about.
going, Barbara. I'm really glad you brought this up,
Yes.
because you had this tremendous entrenched opposition to
Yes.
him. Politically or racially, everyone agrees that. It's been a very
Yes.
nasty 8 years. But then he's done other things. You know, the first
Yes.
black Attorney General of the United States, and not just any black attorney.
When seven.
Huh?
Yes, well, yes.
Eric
keep on
Holder.
going,
I mean,
yes.
Eric Holder
Yes.
was, you know, a civil rights leader.
And his alter ego, right? Because Eric could talk about race, and Eric did talk about race. And of course, Eric was hated very viciously by Congress, called up and really persecuted by Congress. Nevertheless, the president should have in his first year done two things that he did not do: prioritize judges and prioritize jobs.
He might have
And
to
you
do
know,
that in his
that-
last year as well.
And you know what ended up, he had a 2-year window that he squandered. And
You
that's
mean
one
when
of the points.
Yes.
the
So
Democrats
he had the
were in
Democratic
charge
Congress, he had the
in
Democratic
Congress as
Senate,
well, yeah.
and he sit there playing kumbaya. I want to get along with Republicans. They were not trying to get along with him. We might have seen a very different kind of administration.
So he was
had
trying to be Lincoln when everyone else was trying to be Nixon. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly. And you know,
it's
with
a
the jobs
mystery.
thing, and the jobs thing is important because by 2010, people's
Yes.
economic situation had not changed for
That's
people,
right.
and so they voted in reaction. I know that health was important. It was extremely important. He mishandled health. Then by the time that Senator Kennedy had passed, you had to wait on the Scott Brown vote. But what you see there is that had he gone with the jobs, it would have been easy then to get health.
Right.
But the flip side is you got health, and it's a singular accomplishment. Nobody can take that away from him, even as they chip away at Obamacare, Affordable Care Act. You can't take that away from him. But you still have people, and in the African-American community, you are still seeing a powerfully painful joblessness.
I want
still.
to pick up on that because the figures are
Devastating.
quite stark. In fact, if you compare the figures of the Obama administration with previous administrations, they still don't look good when you're talking about the number of African Americans as a proportion of the community still mired in poverty. Is that, Joe, I just want everyone to pick up on here. Joe first. Is that because of the economic cycle we've been through? Because it has been particularly brutal to the middle class and people below it as well.
I don't know. The economists might be better answering that than,
Well, how do you feel?
than I am. I think what it is, it's race, and here's a formula. R equals P plus P. Race equals prejudice plus power. Presidents play to power. When Wall Street is in power, when we end up giving Wall Street bankers all the money they need to bail out, and then they turn around and do
whatever they
the
want.
same thing, and you don't put any strings attached to it, then you become president of the United States as he did, and he's basically told, you can't undo this.
But you know, the other piece of it is that when you have cyclical changes in the economy, and we've seen that, we've seen the economy go down, now it's trying to come back up, there are ways legally, there are ways through law, through public policy that you can protect people.
And
we've
you
done
made
it
this
before.
point in your
Right.
book, actually,
Yes.
that
Yeah.
there was not enough targeting of this, right?
That's right.
Not enough targeting, not enough protection, not enough. There are just so many things that could have been done that weren't done. And they did not have to be directed at black people.
And I
they
think-
could have been directed at urban people. They could have been directed at poor people. I mean, this president.
What you're saying is he
acted-
didn't have to use the word black,
No,
right,
because
Barbara?
he acted like his mouth would freeze if he said
should have
black.
done some things that were black.
You know,
I mean,
but
how
like-
do you go through the first cabinet and no black woman?
Yes.
I mean, come on. I mean, there are these issues that he should have thought about black. He also could have done, as you said, more general things. I think, he knew that he was coming into this housing crisis and that African Americans had been sold all these
Their
predatory...
wealth is primarily in their homes.
Right,
That's
and he knew that. And he knew that the predatory lending problem was a huge one. That should have been told to the housing and urban development, that's your #1 priority, is to make sure that those homes aren't lost, that you protect people from foreclosure.
Instead, you lost,
sorry, guys,
instead you lost about almost a third of all African-American wealth. All of it.
It was crushing, absolutely crushing, right? And when there's lots more to talk about, we're going to have to go to break. We haven't even started talking about Black Lives Matter, which really came in the second term of the president. Fascinating discussion. We do need to take a break, though. More of our conversation after this. Stay with us. You are watching The Heat.
Maybe we now realize the way racial bias can infect us even when we don't realize it. So that we're guarding against not just racial slurs, but we're also guarding against the subtle impulse to call Johnny back for a job interview, but not Jamal.
That was US President Barack Obama speaking at the Mass for Pastor Clementa Pinckney, one of the 9 people, of course, killed by a white shooter at a historic black church in South Carolina last year. Welcome back. We're talking about race relations in the United States. Thanks so much to the panel joining us again. I just want to pick up with you, Julianne, because we ended with Barbara in the previous segment. A lot has happened in the second term, too, and we've seen a lot of allegations of police violence, black men unarmed, gunned down in the streets. We saw what happened in Ferguson, the Black Lives Matter movement. This is quite incredible that this is happening to an outsider, perhaps, under an African-American president.
The fact that this president is African-American has nothing to do with structural racism. The fact that we have an African-American president does not mean someone has sprinkled magic dust around this country and people have let go of their racial ideas. In fact, I think that because we have an African-American president, what we've had is a major racial backlash. We've seen the N-word used a lot more, very casually. You've seen people talk openly about, you know, being racist. You've seen the Trump rhetoric, which has not been as pointedly directed to African Americans as others, but has been very pointedly directed. And so I think that many feel, even as President Obama was elected, you heard people celebrating, now we can be post-racial. Well, how can you be post-racial?
There's a lot of white people saying that, I presume.
Yeah, but how can you be post-racial when the black unemployment rate is twice the white rate? I'll be post-racial when I have
when the
same kind of data that actually whites are experiencing. And so we've seen a horrid backlash, and that backlash has empowered people to say some of the kinds of things that they wouldn't say, 10 years ago.
And you said the magic words, structural racism. It's fascinating to me that the first time this president uttered that term, and he actually said systemic racism, was at that Mass. And then the same year at the NAACP convention. What if he had talked about that his entire term? 2 terms. What a difference it would have made for Americans to understand that structural racism is the enemy and that demographic change is good. If he had just said that.
Yeah, I think one of us is going to have to at least say this, and that is clearly the Obama administration was thinking ahead to the second term.
Right.
There's no ifs, ands, buts about it. He knew how he got elected. He got elected by saying we're not a blue nation, we're not a red nation,
we are the
United Nation, a united people, and that appealed to a lot of individuals. But what white America has got to stop doing is every time somebody says Black Lives Matter, then they go, well, all lives matter. Well, of course, all lives matter, but you do not use that as a way to somehow suggest that if I focus on my life, I'm not diminishing your life.
But
sorry, Julia, just one thing, because we are talking about US President Barack Obama, and I do want to play some words before we run out of time. And this was his reaction to the killing of Trayvon Martin, of course, who was shot by George Zimmerman. Let's have a look at this, because I want to ask you why he said this and didn't necessarily say things earlier in his term. Let's play it.
When Trayvon Martin was first shot, I said that this could have been my son. Another way of saying that is Trayvon Martin could have been me 35 years ago. There are very few African-American men in this country who haven't had the experience of being followed when they were shopping in a department store. That includes me. There are very, very few African American men who haven't had the experience of walking across the street and hearing the locks click on the doors of cars. That happens to me, at least before I was a senator. There are very few African Americans who haven't had the experience of getting on an elevator and a woman clutching her purse nervously and holding her breath until she had a chance to get off.
Julianne, do you see those as really strong words that perhaps he could have used earlier in his term about all other elements of race?
They should have been used earlier. When he had the beer summit, I write about a bit in the book, when Henry Louis Gates, someone broke...
That's right, the professor at Harvard.
Yeah, they
That's
arrested
right.
him for breaking into his own house, and it devolved. And then the president said something I thought was perfectly right. Every black man has had this experience. And then the police sort of hollered, and so he has this beer summit where the professor gets to sit with the policeman who arrested him. I mean, I think that requires enormous forbearance. And my response was, invite Pookie to a beer summit. You know, invite somebody who really has something to say to one of these beer summits. I want to very quickly circle back around to the Black Lives Matter, only to say this. Black lives are the only lives that have been constitutionally devalued. We were constitutionally 3/5 of a person. So it does make sense to assert that Black lives matter, that we are equal. This is something that our society does not claim. And this president, in trying to have it both ways, I mean, in his 2008 speech, which you mentioned, he talked about immigration and all of it. He basically made slavery and immigration the same thing, which they aren't. He keeps trying to have it both ways. He could have been such a transformative leader. Instead, what he's been is an adequate center-left president. I don't think we would have gotten much different had we Hillary Clinton in 2008.
Well, I actually think that probably some of the best work that he's done, and it has been second term.
Is that because he didn't have to face re-election?
Right.
I mean, every president runs to get re-elected.
Barbara, it's been this last year.
It has been.
It's been this last year, not the whole term.
And it's been Black Lives Matters when he absolutely, you know, stood up and had the summit and had the meeting with the Black Lives Matter activists and leaders. I think that was a good move.
Yes.
I think his taking on criminal justice reform and saying that mass incarceration needs to be stopped and pushing for that. I wish, of course, they were a lot stronger. I don't like the bill that's in front of Congress right now. It's a bad bill.
He's had to do a deal with Republicans.
It's a bad bill. And it's not going to accomplish what's needed. And putting Loretta Lynch.
Yeah,
Yes.
and the
Finally a black woman on the cabinet.
and I hope that they would think about a black woman for a Supreme Court justice.
Absolutely.
But I would also say this. Let me add this, because I empathize very much with the president on this. I can walk out of here now dressed like I'm dressed with my background and resume, and I can't get a cab in Washington, D.C. And let me tell you something. This is what we need to understand. This is cultural. And I've said this all my life. In America, and globally, quite honestly, we are culturally conditioned to believe that white is superior and black is inferior. And the manifestation of that cultural conditioning is that black people are undervalued, underestimated, and marginalized. And until that is reversed, we are always going to have this issue of race.
And underpaid. And undervalued, but we also have to talk about underpaid because of the whole issues of access. A series of issues germinate from the fact that we have this pay issue. We have things like access to education, but also things like dental care. Things that make a serious difference in qualities of life. 25% of young African Americans have never seen a dentist, even though they have 25%. And it's 29.6% to be exact. But just go down and look at some of these things. And so, you know, someone might listen to the president talking about not getting a cab or listening to Joe talk about it and say, that's no big thing.
Yes,
but it's a huge thing
yeah.
because that's not getting a cab, it's everything.
These are quality of life things that mean something bigger, right?
Yes.
Right, and also there are economic consequences, right? If you can't get a cab when you need one, I mean, I've had instances where I've been late to things because no cab would stop and get me. So these are real. And I also think that, you know, that when we look at this president's record, that we got to remember that because we live in a society based on white structural racism, that when white people hear Black Lives Matters, they hear it as an anti-white message. And that's why they respond. And that's because...
But whenever they hear the word white...
that's because white supremacy has always been tied to the word white. And they don't understand that when blacks use blacks, they're not tying it to black supremacy.
White,
So
look,
you
white
think
is
the whole
the
different
no.
answer has really helped
Well, white-
actually push the president further than he
Yeah.
wanted to
It's
go?
pushed the
no.
president.
Oh,
It's
absolutely.
It's
pushed
absolutely.
both the Democratic candidates.
Yes.
I think that it has ossified the racism on the part of some of the Republican candidates, and you
Yes.
can hear their resistance to it. I think that these young people are absolutely brilliant.
I love them.
They are the inheritors of the dream, and they're going about it in very, very appropriate ways.
they-
It's just extremely important
Yeah,
to watch them do their work.
they are the SNCC of the 21st
They are,
century.
yes.
That's what they are.
I'm old enough to remember that. A lot of our audience isn't. That's a subject for another programme. Julianne Malveaux, Joe Edison, Barbara Unwin, thank you so much for
Thank
joining
you.
us. As we end this programme, perhaps it is only fitting that we set aside policy and politics, it's, if only for a moment, to reflect on a truly human experience. 106-year-old Virginia McLaurin waited all her life to see an African American in the White House. Her reaction might just say it all.
How are you?
I'm fine.
Oh, it's so nice to see you.
It's an honor.
You want to say hi to Michelle?
Yeah.
Slow down now. I don't know how you shit. She's 106.
No, you are not. You are not.
Well, you slow down.
Oh my goodness. I thought I would never live to get in the White House.
Well, you are right
here.
here.
And I tell you, you
Well,
are here. So happy. We are happy to have you. Like president. Look at him. Hey, right there. Like, that's me. Yes. I'm here to celebrate.
A truly remarkable moment. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Nathan King in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for being with us.